Hi there. I'd like to talk about vaccinations and the social and legal responses to them in the US and in Japan. I'll briefly go through some history of people's responses to vaccinations, and I'm going to focus on the measles and give you some data on that as a paradigm case. Then I'll go into the responses of people who are pro-vaccine and anti-vaccine, and then what certain governments in the US and Japan have done in terms of requiring or not requiring them. Ultimately, I'm trying to get you to answer the question, should governments enact mandatory vaccination plans for children? In other words, should the government make people get vaccinations? Well, England was the first place to develop a vaccine. A famous case of a man named Jenner, who found that he could take certain amounts of the cowpox virus and inject that into people to prevent smallpox virus, as smallpox and cowpox are in the same genus and highly related. It has made people nervous. It's the first time they really, for many of them, heard about this type of treatment, and there was a reaction. So this political cartoon is dramatizing people's feelings that something really dangerous might happen if they inject this stuff under their skin. Now, despite public nervousness, the governments continued on. This spread all over Europe and went across to America very quickly, where the President Thomas Jefferson led the campaign to spread the vaccination around the country, because it worked. It came to Japan in the 1849, and so I took this image, I believe, from the 1850s. This was a time when Japan was going through a transition in society from the more traditional one governed by the feudal system and the Tokugawa shogun into one that was characterized by looking at Western medicine and learning in general. So they call this one, "Who named God of Smallpox?" Meaning this one, "Is that the devil's doing?" The rough translation says. It wants to say that no, this disease is not caused by anything divine. It has a natural cause, and therefore we can derive a natural solution from a cow. And this is a type of a poster to promote smallpox vaccination. To give another sense of the Japanese reaction to modern medicine, I take this one from the 1860s, again the transition period in Japan, that shows foods that can be eaten by measles patients. These foods are listed here and represented by these dancing spirits who are trying to help the man. The patient obviously doesn't feel good for two reasons. He's sick of vomiting, but he's also sick of losing his money to the doctor whose cure he doesn't necessarily trust. I just thought an interesting image that shows some of the tension between traditional approaches and new medicalized approaches. Well, getting to the modern day, I'm going to focus on measles because it's a well-known viral infection that has a very effective vaccine. It's a vaccine-preventable disease that has been going through a big outbreak in 2019. So what is measles? Most people think that it's characterized by a skin rash that happens within a few days after infection. But it can also be associated with high fever, cough, runny nose, and watery eyes. It's caused by this virus, the measles morbivirus, also called measles virus. Now, there are complications, though. About 1 in 5 unvaccinated people are hospitalized. And in extreme cases, 1 to 3 of every 1,000 children can die from respiratory infections, such as pneumonia, or neurologic complications like encephalitis. Historically, measles was widespread throughout the population. Roughly, we could say an average of 500,000 people infected each year with varying degrees of severity until the vaccine was introduced. It was 1963, and it was a dramatic drop. It's just so obvious that the vaccine started to work. Now, it wasn't perfect, and that's partly because coverage wasn't perfect as well. And like with most medical treatments, there were some bumps along the way. And now we are recommended to get a booster shot later on to make sure the vaccine is strong enough. But since the early 90s, it's virtually been eliminated in the US. And if we look at mortality rates, we can see that thankfully, basically, people don't die anymore. This is deaths per 100,000 in America. So again, up and down, fluctuating like incidence rates. It was already going down because of a variety of better healthcare. And one thing I noticed, though, that the graphs disagree, and I had trouble finding data on this kind of thing. But in general, I think it's fair to say that post-vaccination days, there's almost no deaths anymore. A similar story happened in England and Wales. I didn't show the graph, but in Canada it looks similar, where after the vaccine, you don't have perfect elimination, but after coverage reaches a certain amount, basically we achieve something called herd immunity. H-E-R-D, herd immunity. That means you have group immunity. After the MMR was introduced in England, then it really dropped. MMR is a combination shot of measles, mumps, and rubella. These days it's often packaged with 4, including chickenpox. And this clustering is actually one thing that makes a lot of parents uncomfortable. I'll come to that. Now let's turn to a different case. In Japan, it's a slightly different story. Now, the vaccine was introduced in the decade after the US, so relatively soon. And like we saw in the US and UK, it didn't completely eliminate it. And in fact, in Japan, it took quite a longer time. Over this 10-year period from 1976 to 1984, we can roughly see a trend of decline, but it's not so obvious. Now, let me highlight that this is just in Aichi Prefecture. I had trouble finding data for the whole country. But let's look at what happened. After vaccination rates went up in the late 2000s, it seemed like Japan got it under control. I mean, this is quite dramatic in just 4 years. We see a case of a nationwide drop of 25-fold from 2008 to 2011. Incredibly effective, and it had been very low from 2011 on. Our Aichi Prefecture, which we saw, a little bit behind the curve, but still getting better. Now I want to turn to what people's perception of vaccines are. So I'm going to use this question from the Ignorance Project, which is part of Gapminder and Hans Rosling. They asked people around the world, what percentage of world's 1-year-old children is vaccinated against measles? What do you think? 20%, 50%, or 80%? If you guessed it was 80%, you would be correct, but you would also be in the minority of people. Most people underestimate the amount of vaccine coverage worldwide. It's actually 84% now. Americans were asked this question in 2013, and only 17% of them got it right. In fact, more people thought that it was only 20% than anything else, which is extremely wrong. People just don't think vaccination coverage is that as much as it is. So let's actually take a look at it. So for our 2 countries of interest, Japan and US, we can see that for the last 10 to 20 years, coverage has been quite nice. Above 90%, since the mid-90s. And in Japan's case, they have gotten above the critical 95% coverage, which is often cited as what's needed for herd immunity. The US, interestingly, tends to be just below 95, hovering between roughly 91 and 94. And as we see, also the world has caught up. Please also note that, as I mentioned, Japan had been behind the US in terms of vaccinations, which could account for their lack of catching up until around 2011. But what's been happening? In the last decade, measles cases have been spiking. You see from this chart that they remained relatively low until 2014 when we had quite a spike. And now really the reason I'm using measles today is because we're in a major outbreak. It's only halfway through the year in 2019, and already we are approaching double of the previous highest of the post-vaccine widespread coverage era. And this is significant because it was declared domestically eradicated in the US in 2000. So these cases really represent imported cases infecting people who do not have the vaccination. A famous case where I'm from, California, is the so-called Disneyland outbreak. And in 2015, this is what prompted California the next year to enact mandatory vaccinations. Apparently, some international travelers at Disneyland carried the measles in, and non-vaccinated kids were infected. 2019 has been bad in Japan as well. I couldn't find the most recent data, but even just in terms of March, they were saying that 170 new cases represents the highest rate as of the first quarter of the year in 10 years, since that 2009 period that I told you about earlier. Same has been true in some other countries as well, that 2019 has been a special year for measles. Let's look at some more factors behind this. Well, according to the WHO, vaccine hesitancy is a major factor, and they've called this one of the biggest threats to global health this year. They define it as the delay in the acceptance or refusal of vaccines despite availability of vaccination services. And this is happening in several countries around the world. I'd like to go over quickly some names that we call people who oppose vaccinations. So if you are in support of them, you might say vaccine rights advocate. If you are against them, you might call them anti-vaxxers. I will try to use the neutral term vaccine hesitant people. So what are the concerns of vaccine hesitant people? Well, their major issues are the clustering of vaccines, and especially the measles, mumps, rubella, and chickenpox vaccine. They think that the immunological burden is too high on kids. They're nervous about pre- and postnatal vaccination schedules for mom and baby, including HBV, sorry, that should say HBV, which is hepatitis B vaccine. They are worried about very severe adverse effects of the vaccine. There's claims that vaccines cause autism, Guillain-Barré syndrome, deafness, and other things. I am not very concerned about these myself, and I'm skeptical about the data of those, although I don't deny vaccines carry some risk. But what I'd like to focus on is this final one, the abuse of civil and human rights. That is, can you make people take a vaccine? Is that ethical? So anti-vaccine advocates will often cite this passage from the Nuremberg Code, which was written after the doctor's trial of Nazi physicians after World War II and the horrors experienced in Nazi Germany. So I'd like to read this first line. Now, please do keep in mind that this is written for human experiments and not for human health delivery services, but it seems quite applicable. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This means that the person involved should have legal capacity to give consent, should be so situated as to be able to exercise free power of choice without the intervention of any element of force, and should have sufficient knowledge and comprehension of the elements of the subject matter involved as to enable him to make an understanding and enlightened decision. So if the government is trying to force you to have a vaccine, it does seem to violate principles of voluntary consent. It seems to violate the free power of choice. And people also claim that government bodies like the CDC actually don't give sufficient knowledge. But I am skeptical of that section of the claim, personally. Yet, I won't deny that vaccines carry a certain risk. Now, there was a scare with the measles vaccine in Japan. From 1989 to 1993, Japan introduced a required measles, mumps, rubella triple shot for the first time. You may remember that Britain introduced theirs in the 1980s as well. But the type of vaccine that Japan was using was different. And it would seem that the quality was not up to the standard of that used in Britain and other countries. And the government reported a 2,000-fold higher rate of report of adverse effects than what would be expected, which is one case in every 100,000 to 200,000 vaccinations. So indeed, everybody admits that there is some risk to vaccinations on this type of a scale. Now, it is claimed, and the government did pay out, to admit a certain amount of guilt, that 3 children died from these vaccines. 8 developed severe permanent disorders, and hundreds of others became unusually sick. There were also problems with the triple shot in the US and UK as well at the beginning. Well, the current situation in Japan after this scare is to give 2 separate shots. You give a measles and then an MR separately. And interestingly, while these vaccines are called required, there is no penalty for non-compliance. But clinics offer these required vaccines for free. And now the people actually have extremely high coverage. As I showed you on the graph earlier, it's been above 95% since 2012 without being forcefully mandated. Now, California has taken a different approach. The year after the Disneyland scare, a law went into effect requiring public school children to be vaccinated against the following diseases. And that is, when I say required, they won't be allowed to attend public kindergarten without a medical exemption. And I should say that in the US, kindergarten is part of elementary. So I really should say they cannot attend elementary school unless they've been vaccinated. But there is an option for a medical exemption. Anyway, they must be vaccinated against polio, whooping cough, chickenpox, hepatitis B, and measles. An interesting statistic is that as of mid-2019, the number of medical exemptions is reported to have risen rapidly, which indicates that parents who have a religious or philosophical objection to vaccines are pushing doctors to grant them a medical exemption. Well, so that's my question to you. In light of this knowledge, do you think that governments should enact mandatory vaccination plans for children? If you think so, which vaccines should be mandatory? What should be the penalties for non-compliance? And then how can you enforce it? If you don't think governments should enact mandatory vaccination plans, please explain why you think that. Why should people be free to choose? And how can you protect people that can't receive vaccines for medical reasons? Because as I mentioned, there is always going to be a vulnerable population of immunocompromised people, or of infants who are too young to receive a vaccine that might be exposed. Or do you have another method to discourage vaccine hesitancy? I'm looking forward to your answers.